We need to end this marriage.
You've already made the decision.
I have. The paperwork's finished. My attorney prepared everything. It's already been reviewed. You keep the house. The SUV stays with you. You'll receive monthly support for 2 years. It's fair.
Fair? For who?
You can fight this if you want, but it'll cost you more than you'll ever get.
I understand.
Good. I knew you'd see reason.
Hello, Linda? Yes, I am ready. Well? He filed exactly when you predicted. And the offer? Exactly the one we expected. How many items? 14. I'm contesting all of them.
In January of 2022, Robert Carter sat down across a table from his wife, of 22 years, and told her he wanted a divorce. His attorney had already prepared the paperwork. He had already had it reviewed. The settlement offer was on the table before the conversation was over. And as he laid it out, the house, the car, a monthly payment for 2 years, he said something that Diane Carter has never forgotten. He said, "You can fight this if you want, but it will cost you more than you will ever get." He said it with the particular confidence of a man who has been planning something for a long time and believes he has thought of everything. He had not thought of everything. He had not thought of the composition notebook in the locking drawer of Diane Carter's home office desk, where she had been recording dates, amounts, and account numbers for the past 18 months. He had not thought of the family law attorney in the next county who had been reading those records since October. And he had absolutely no idea that the woman sitting across that kitchen table from him, nodding calmly at his settlement offer, had already read every line of it and identified 14 items she intended to contest. He thought leaving her with nothing was the end of the story. He was wrong about which story he was in. In the story Robert Carter believed he was living, the one where a careful man outmaneuvers an unsuspecting wife and walks away from a 22-year marriage with his financial empire intact. He had done everything correctly. In the story Diane Carter had been quietly preparing to tell for the past 18 months, he had made the most consequential error available to someone in his position. He had underestimated the person he was married to. By the time he understood this, the discovery process had been running for 4 months, and his own attorney was asking him questions he did not have comfortable answers to. By the end of this story, you will understand how a woman who was handed a settlement offer designed to leave her dependent and diminished walked out of a 7-month legal process with 40% of a business her husband valued at $800,000 and an independent valuation placed at $4.1 million. You will understand what she did in the 3 years after the divorce finalized that left Robert Carter sitting 2 tables away from her at a charity event with nothing to say that would have changed a single thing about the story she was now in. And you will understand why the most important decision she made was not the one she made in court, but the one she made 18 months before he filed, when she opened a composition notebook and wrote down the first date. There are 3 questions that are going to drive everything you hear in the next 2 hours. The first, how does a woman who was systematically excluded from the financial architecture of her own marriage, no formal employment for 20 years, no business in her name, no access to accounts she did not know existed, build a legal case strong enough to recover assets a professional real estate developer had spent 2 full years concealing? Because this was not a simple situation. Robert Carter was not an amateur. He had spent 26 months restructuring the financial landscape of a marriage before he told his wife the marriage was over. He had a competent attorney. He had a cooperating brother. He had an understanding of real estate law sufficient to use it as a vehicle for concealment. And he was facing a woman he had decided, across 22 years, was not a financial threat. The second question, what happened to the story Robert Carter believed he had written? The one about a man who plans carefully, moves assets strategically, and exits cleanly, when the person he thought was the victim turned out to have been the investigator. Because Diane Carter did not become an investigator after Robert filed. She became one 18 months before he filed. She was already building the record that would define the legal process before he had even served the paperwork. She had chosen her attorney before he chose his. She had begun the documentation before he had completed the restructuring. He thought he was ahead. He was not ahead. He had never been ahead. And by the time the discovery process revealed this, there was nothing about the situation that could be rearranged to change the outcome. And the third question, what does a woman do in the years after a marriage like this one ends, with the freedom that arrives when the person who was standing in every doorway she tried to walk through finally removes himself from the picture? Because the settlement was not the end of Diane Carter's story. It was the resource that funded the beginning of it. What she built in the 3 years after the divorce finalized is the part of this story that the people who knew Robert Carter were least prepared to explain. Carter Interiors launched from the home that had once been mortgaged and became, in its second year of operation, a Charlotte area business with 11 active clients and a regional profile that described its founder as a new voice with a particular gift for spaces that balance warmth and function. Robert Carter had told their mutual friends, in the months after the separation, that Diane did not have the head for business. She launched a business anyway. It turned out the head she had been using was more than sufficient. Before we go any further into this incredible story, do me a favor. If you love stories about justice, betrayal, revenge, and unexpected plot twists, hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, you do not want to miss what comes next on this channel. Drop a like on this video. It helps more than you think. And comment below where you are watching from, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Diane grew up in East Charlotte, in the kind of household that gives a child either a permanent anxiety about money or a permanent education in it, depending entirely on how the adults around them carry the weight. In Diane's case, it was the second. Her mother, Carol, worked a daytime shift as a seamstress at a textile company on the East Side and ran a small bookkeeping side practice from the kitchen table every evening. 2 jobs, neither of them glamorous. Both of them performed with the specific competence of a woman who understood that the alternative to performing them well was a conversation she was not interested in having. Carol never described their circumstances as difficult. She described them as the shape of their life, and she moved through that shape with an unhurried practicality that Diane absorbed before she had language for it. What Carol taught her daughter, not in words but in every observed action across Diane's childhood, was this: money is information. It tells you what a person values, what they are planning, and, most importantly, what they do not want you to know. Diane was a good student in the specific way of students who are genuinely curious rather than merely compliant. The kind of child who asks the follow-up question, who goes back to the library for the second book on the same subject, who keeps a notebook not because she is required to, but because she has noticed that writing things down helps her think more clearly. She enrolled at the University of North Carolina's Interior Design program in the fall of 1994, at 18 years old, on a partial academic scholarship that Carol had helped her research with the same focused attention Carol brought to everything she considered worth doing correctly. Interior design suited Diane's particular intelligence. She had always been spatially perceptive, had always found the arrangement of a room to be a form of communication, had always understood instinctively that how a space is organized tells you something about the person who organized it. She was good at the program. Her faculty advisor told her, at the end of her first year, that she had a natural sophistication in her design sensibility that typically took students several years to develop. She met Robert Carter at a party in the spring of her second year. He was 25, already working as a real estate agent at a firm in South Charlotte, and he had a quality that Diane would spend the next 2 decades coming to understand with increasing precision. He made the person he was talking to feel, in the moment of conversation, like the most interesting and most considered person in any room he had ever been in. This is an extremely effective quality in a person, and it is extremely difficult to distinguish, from the inside, from genuine attentiveness. Robert was genuinely attentive to Diane in the specific way of a man who has identified something he wants, and is bringing his full capacity to the work of obtaining it. She interpreted this as being seen. She had not been seen in that particular way before. She left the university the following year when she became pregnant. She does not describe this as a mistake. She describes it as a decision made with the information available to her at the time, which was insufficient, but which she has long since stopped spending energy on regretting. Robert and Diane Carter married in a church ceremony in South Charlotte in the summer of 1999, attended by 112 guests, and catered by a company Robert had researched and selected without asking Diane whether it was a company she wanted. The photographer was also Robert's selection. The venue had been Robert's first choice. The flowers were the ones Diane had asked for, which she understood only later was because the flowers were the detail that mattered least to the picture Robert was constructing. This is the thing about control that makes it so difficult to identify from inside a marriage. It rarely presents itself as control. It presents itself as efficiency, or as decisiveness, or as one partner simply being better organized than the other. The person on the receiving end spends years telling themselves they are grateful for a partner who handles things, until the day they begin to notice that what is being handled is also them. In the early years, the Carters built the surface architecture of a successful American family with remarkable efficiency. Robert's real estate career expanded from residential sales to residential development in the early 2000s, a transition that required the kind of sustained organizational focus that he provided and that the household's domestic stability made possible. That domestic stability was provided entirely by Diane: the childcare, the household management, the social calendar, the school communications, the medical appointments, the family relationships, the invisible infrastructure of a life that looked uncomplicated from the outside because someone was working full-time to make it look that way. Robert attended the dinner parties and the children's events and the neighborhood association meetings that Diane organized and scheduled and reminded him to attend. He was warm and funny at these events. He was good company. The people who knew Robert Carter through his professional and social life described him uniformly as straightforward, generous, and dependable. They were not wrong about what they had observed. They had simply observed him in the rooms where he wanted to be observed. By 2010, Carter Development Group had grown from a solo operation to a small firm with 3 employees and a portfolio of 6 investment properties across Mecklenburg and Cabarrus counties. Robert was 41 years old and earning a professional income that the household's financial structure did not require Diane to understand in detail. She had access to the household checking account and the credit card that covered domestic expenses. She did not have access to the business accounts, the investment property accounts, or the retirement accounts that Robert managed through a financial advisor whose name she knew but whom she had met once. She did not, at this stage, identify this arrangement as a problem. She had not yet developed the financial vocabulary to articulate what the arrangement actually was, a structure in which one partner maintained complete information and the other maintained functional ignorance, arranged so naturally that the partner without information had not been given a reason to notice what she was missing. In the spring of 2016, when Elena was 19 and Marcus was 16, Diane Carter told Robert she wanted to go back to work, not to the university. She had no interest in completing a degree she had left 20 years ago for entirely different reasons. She wanted to formalize what she had been doing informally for most of their marriage. Interior design consulting. She had a referral network built through years of advising friends and neighbors on their homes without accepting payment. She had researched the licensing requirements in North Carolina. She had a name chosen for the business. She had a projected startup cost of approximately $4,000, which was a fraction of what the household spent in a month. She presented this to Robert over dinner on a Wednesday evening with the careful thoroughness of someone who has anticipated the objections and addressed them in advance. Robert told her it was a wonderful idea. He said he was proud of her. He told her she should absolutely do it. He meant none of these things in the way she understood them. What followed over the next 8 months was a masterclass in the kind of obstruction that never announces itself as obstruction. Robert accepted 2 evening social engagements on evenings Diane had specifically designated for client consultations, accepted them without consulting her calendar, then expressed confusion when she mentioned the conflict. He referred to her design work, twice in the presence of friends, as her hobby, not maliciously, with a fond smile, as though the word were a compliment. He mentioned to Diane in October, in the specific tone of someone raising a concern rather than issuing a prohibition, that several of his commercial contacts had assumed the business was struggling when their wives returned to work, and that he hoped that wouldn't create an uncomfortable perception for the firm. He said, "I'm just flagging it. Do whatever feels right to you." Diane did not start the business in 2016. She has said since that she is not certain she made a conscious decision not to start it, only that by December of that year, the conditions for starting it had, somehow, not materialized, and that the spring of the following year found her still planning and not yet doing. She did not stop thinking about it. She simply stopped saying so. Melissa Wade joined Carter Development Group in March of 2019 as a business development associate. She was 32 years old, a UNC Charlotte business graduate with 4 years of commercial real estate experience at a competing firm, and she was precisely the kind of hire that a growing development company in a strengthening Charlotte real estate market needed. Competent, well-connected, energetic in her client relationship work, and willing to work the evening and weekend hours that business development in real estate routinely requires. Robert introduced her to Diane at the firm's spring networking event, a casual gathering at a restaurant in South Charlotte that Diane attended because Robert's events were the kind of events she attended. Melissa Wade shook Diane's hand, said it was lovely to meet her, and moved on to the next conversation. Diane shook her hand, said the same, and filed away 3 observations. Melissa Wade was younger and professionally polished. Robert had said her name 4 times in 90 seconds, in the way people say the names of things they are currently thinking about, more than they mean to. And there was a quality to the introduction, the slight excess of casualness in Robert's posture, that Diane recognized as the posture of someone performing a relaxation they did not entirely feel. She said nothing. She filed it. She went home. The following 6 months provided 3 additional data points. Robert began attending evening business meetings with a frequency that had no precedent in 20 years of running a business. He began paying closer attention to his phone during evenings at home, not obviously, not dramatically, but in the way of someone managing a thing they have not yet decided how to manage. And at the firm's Christmas party in December of 2019, Diane watched Melissa Wade move through the room relative to Robert, and recognized, in the specific geometry of how 2 people navigate a shared social space, that the professional relationship she had been introduced to in March had become something that required considerably more careful management. She drove home that evening in the passenger seat, while Robert talked about a development deal he was excited about, and she looked at the highway and thought for a long time about what it meant to know something you had not been told. She thought about her mother. She thought about the kitchen table and the ledger. She thought about money being information. Then she stopped thinking and started planning. In October of 2020, Diane Carter drove to an office supply store in South Charlotte and purchased a spiral-bound composition notebook with a navy blue cover. She did not purchase it near her home. She paid cash. She brought it back to the house and placed it in the locking drawer of her home office desk, a drawer she had maintained as her own space for 15 years and that Robert had never had reason to open. On the first page, she wrote the date, October 14th, 2020. Below the date, she wrote the name of a limited liability company she had found referenced in a document that had come through the household printer and been placed in the outgoing mail tray by mistake. The document was a formation notice, the kind of paperwork that confirms the establishment of a new business entity. The LLC was registered in Delaware. The registered agent was Thomas Carter, Robert's older brother. Thomas Carter was a building contractor in Concord, North Carolina, who had not, in 30 years of professional life, ever been involved in commercial real estate investment. Diane wrote down the LLC name, the registration date she found through a public records search she conducted from her personal laptop, and the name of the registered agent. Then she put the notebook in the drawer, locked it, and went to the kitchen to make dinner. She had begun. Over the following weeks, Diane developed a documentation practice that she maintained with the same disciplined consistency she had brought to every organized system in her life. She checked the household printer's sent queue and the outgoing mail tray every morning after Robert left for work. When relevant documents appeared, and they appeared with more frequency than Robert likely intended, because people who are managing complex financial structures sometimes grow careless about the borders between their personal and domestic administrative lives, she photographed them with her personal cell phone. She noted the date, the document type, and what she understood the document to be doing. When she did not understand what a document was doing, she wrote that down too, and researched the question from her personal laptop in private browsing mode at times when the house was empty. She stored copies of every photograph in a cloud account she had created, under a name that was not her married name, accessed exclusively from her personal device using a password she had memorized and never written down. She was not a lawyer. She was not an accountant. She was a woman who had grown up watching her mother keep ledgers, and who understood, at the level of instinct, that the point of a record is not what it contains at the moment of its creation, but what it becomes available to prove in the moment when proof is required. In the 3rd week of October 2020, Diane Carter drove 45 minutes to the office of Patricia Okafor in Cabarrus County. She had found Patricia through a referral from a college friend who had gone through a contested divorce 2 years prior, and who Diane had called from a parking lot on her personal phone, having deleted the call from her recent calls list immediately afterward. Patricia Okafor's office was on the 2nd floor of a professional building in Concord. Diane had told Robert she was visiting her mother in Charlotte, which was true, She had made the visit to her mother first and then driven north to Concord. She arrived 12 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with a magazine open in her lap and absorbed nothing printed on its pages. When the receptionist called her name, she picked up the manila folder she had brought with her. The photographs she had already taken, printed at a drugstore she had stopped at on the way, and she walked into Patricia Okafor's office and sat down across the desk from a woman who had been practicing family law in North Carolina for 23 years, and who had seen, by her own accounting, most things that were possible to see in this line of work. Diane placed the manila folder on the desk and opened it. Patricia Okafor read the first 3 pages of photographs without speaking. Then she looked up and said, "How long have you been keeping this?" Diane said, 3 weeks. Patricia said, "Keep going." She explained the legal framework with the unsentimental precision of someone who has explained difficult information to people in difficult circumstances hundreds of times and has learned that clarity is the most respectful form of help she can offer. What would constitute marital assets under North Carolina's equitable distribution statute, what the discovery process could legally compel, what the burden of proof required, and critically, what kind of documentation would make the difference between a contested claim that could be disputed and a documented fact that could not. She told Diane that if the assets she was describing existed in the form the document suggested, the discovery process would find them. But she told her that discovery was faster and considerably more targeted when the attorney already knew what she was looking for. She told Diane to keep writing. She told her to photograph every document she found access to. She told her to change nothing about her behavior at home. She said the most valuable thing you can do right now is not let him know that you know. Diane drove home. She made dinner. She was entirely herself at the table that evening. She had been practicing being entirely herself at that table for 20 years. Between October of 2020 and January of 2022, Diane Carter maintained what would eventually become, in Patricia Okafor's professional assessment, the most comprehensive pre-filing financial documentation she had seen a client produce in 23 years of family law practice. The notebook grew to 61 pages of dated, formatted entries written in the same black ballpoint pen throughout. The specific consistency of someone who understood from the beginning that what she was writing might eventually need to be read by someone other than herself. She photographed 43 documents that passed through the household's administrative spaces. Formation notices, transfer confirmations, correspondence between Robert and his financial advisor, statements from accounts she had not known existed until they appeared in the outgoing mail tray or the printer queue. She recorded 14 instances of significant cash withdrawals from the household checking account, amounts ranging from $8,000 to $18,000 that did not correspond to any household expense she could identify in the monthly statements she had access to. She tracked 3 additional LLC registrations through Delaware's public records portal, each of them listing Thomas Carter as the registered agent, each of them incorporated within a 14-month window that began 9 months after she had opened the notebook. She sent monthly update emails to Patricia Okafor from an email address she had created specifically for this purpose, an address that was not associated with her name, her phone number, or the household's internet account. She used her personal cell phone on her mobile data connection to send them. Patricia's paralegal would later note, when she transcribed and organized Diane's documentation for the formal discovery file, that the entries were consistent, dated, and written in the hand of someone who had thought about the audience for the document before beginning it. Every notation was legible. Every amount was specific. Every date was verifiable. Patricia Okafor told Diane at their quarterly consultations across those 18 months that what she was building was not merely a record of suspicious activity, it was a map. And when the formal discovery process began, what it would allow Patricia's team to do was not fish for evidence, but walk directly to the locations where the evidence had already been identified. There is an enormous difference between those two things in a contested divorce proceeding, and the difference was about to matter enormously. What Robert Carter was doing in the 26 months before he filed was a version of a pattern that family law attorneys and forensic accountants across the country recognize with increasing frequency in high-asset contested divorces. The systematic transfer of marital assets to structures that would make them difficult to identify as marital property at the point of distribution. The mechanism he chose was the limited liability company, and the reason he chose it is the reason many people in real estate development choose it. An LLC can legitimately hold property assets for investment purposes. And when the managing member or registered agent of the LLC is a third party rather than the asset's true beneficial owner, the connection between the asset and its true owner requires active investigation rather than obvious disclosure. Robert used his brother Thomas because Thomas was the person available to him who would sign the necessary documents without asking questions that complicated the arrangement. He used Delaware because Delaware's LLC formation requirements did not mandate public disclosure of the beneficial ownership of the registered entity. He used the structure carefully over a period of 2 years, moving assets in amounts and at intervals designed not to appear dramatic against the background of a normally operating real estate development business. What he did not account for was the household printer, the formation notices, the transfer confirmations, the operating agreement drafts. These moved through his administrative life as documents, and documents pass through the physical spaces where people live their domestic lives in ways that their creators do not always track precisely. A formation notice printed from a home office and placed in an outgoing mail tray, a confirmation letter that arrived by post and was set on a kitchen counter rather than filed immediately. The operating agreement of a Delaware LLC, whose registered agent was a building contractor from Concord, North Carolina, printed from Robert's home computer late on a Tuesday evening when he believed Diane was watching a documentary in the living room. She was watching a documentary. She was also listening for the printer to stop. She retrieved the document the following morning. She photographed it. She wrote the entry in the notebook that evening. She had now documented the third LLC formation, the third transfer of what appeared to be marital assets into a structure held in Thomas Carter's name, the third piece of a picture that was becoming clearer with each edition. Robert Carter chose a Tuesday evening in January to have the conversation. Both children were away. Elena was at her apartment near Atrium Health. Marcus was at UNC Charlotte. The house was quiet. Robert came home at his normal time, and dinner was normal, and the conversation at the table was normal. And then after the plates were cleared, he asked Diane to sit back down because there was something he needed to talk with her about. He spoke first about the marriage having reached a point where they had grown in different directions. He talked about wanting a different kind of life. He used the language his attorney had advised, careful, non-accusatory, focused on the idea of mutual change rather than individual failing. He was good at this. He had been preparing it for a while, and he delivered it with the practiced ease of someone whose professional life requires them to be able to present an unfavorable position in the most palatable possible framing. Diane sat across from him and listened with her hands in her lap and her face in the attentive, neutral expression she had been managing for 18 months. When he finished the preparatory remarks, he put the manila folder on the table and opened it. He walked her through the settlement offer with the methodical care of someone who wants the other person to understand that they have thought about this thoroughly and have arrived at a fair result. The family home, with the remaining mortgage balance. The Honda, 4 years old. Monthly spousal support of $4,000 for 24 months. No share of Carter Development Group, which Robert's financial disclosure described as a business currently valued at approximately $800,000, carrying significant debt obligations, and with uncertain near-term growth projections. No share of the retirement accounts, which he described as having substantially underperformed due to market conditions in the preceding 3 years. No reference to the 3 LLCs registered in Thomas Carter's name. No reference to the 14 cash withdrawals. No reference to the brokerage account in Robert's individual name to which a portion of the retirement account funds had been quietly transferred. He closed the folder. He looked at her. He said, "You can fight this if you want, but it will cost you more than you will ever get." Diane Carter looked at the folder on the table between them. She had read every line of Robert's financial disclosure 2 days after she received it, because Patricia Okafor had obtained a draft through a professional contact and sent it to Diane's secure email address the evening it was finalized. She had identified 14 items she intended to contest before Robert had scheduled the kitchen table conversation. She picked up her water glass. She took a sip. She said, "Let me have my attorney look at this." Robert nodded. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had expected that response and had no concern about it. He had no reason to be concerned, from where he was sitting. He believed the settlement was clean. He believed the asset transfers were properly structured. He believed that a woman who had not held a paying job in 20 years, who had no independent financial knowledge, who had no legal preparation, and who had just been handed a folder by a man with a prepared attorney, he believed that woman was going to sign. Diane Carter said goodnight and went to her home office and called Patricia Okafor's cell phone from her personal device and said, "He filed the paperwork." Patricia said, "I know. I've been ready for 3 months." She said, "So have I." Patricia Okafor's formal response to Robert Carter's settlement offer was delivered 8 days after Diane received it and can be summarized, in the language of family law, as a rejection accompanied by a notice of intent to contest all identified items. In plain language, it said, "We disagree with every significant element of this offer, and we are entering formal discovery." The discovery process in a contested North Carolina divorce compels both parties to produce financial records, answer written questions called interrogatories under oath, submit to depositions, and comply with subpoenas for records from third parties, including banks, business entities, and financial advisors. It is a legally powerful process, and it is the mechanism through which Diane's 18 months of documentation was about to become something that Robert Carter's attorney could no longer characterize as a wife's unfounded suspicions. Patricia had structured her discovery requests with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for because she had a map of where to look. She did not send broad requests for general financial records. She sent targeted requests for specific account types, specific date ranges, and specific business entities, including by name the 3 Delaware LLCs registered to Thomas Carter. Robert Carter's attorney, David Finch, responded to the initial discovery requests with a motion characterizing them as overbroad and lacking specificity. Patricia Okafor responded to the motion with an amended set of requests that were more specific, not less, each one tied to a particular document, date range, or entity that Diane's documentation had identified. Finch's response to this was to object to the inclusion of the LLC assets on the grounds that they were held by a third party and therefore not subject to marital property distribution. Patricia's counter was a subpoena directed at Thomas Carter personally, requesting the corporate formation documents for all 3 LLCs, the transfer records showing the origin of the funds used to capitalize them, the operating agreements governing their management, and Thomas Carter's personal financial records for the period corresponding to the LLC's incorporation dates. This was the first moment in the process at which Robert Carter showed visible concern. David Finch noted it. Thomas Carter called Robert the evening he received the subpoena. Robert called David Finch the following morning. The call lasted 38 minutes. After the call, Finch filed a motion requesting a 60-day extension to respond to the outstanding discovery requests. The court denied the extension. Patricia had anticipated the motion and had prepared her opposition in advance. Patricia Okafor retained Howard Bell as a forensic accountant 3 weeks into the formal discovery process. Howard Bell had spent 14 years as a certified public accountant before transitioning to forensic accounting in 2012, and he had worked on 34 contested divorce cases in the decade that followed. He was not a flashy expert. He was a methodical one, the kind of forensic accountant whose reports are valued in court not for their dramatic language, but for their complete absence of it. He received the financial records produced in the first round of discovery on a Monday morning and delivered a preliminary report 11 days later. The report identified 4 categories of concern. The first was the business valuation. Carter Development Group had been valued by Robert's financial disclosure at $800,000. Using a methodology that applied an aggressive depreciation schedule to physical assets that had in fact appreciated significantly in the preceding 3 years, and that excluded the company's recurring contract revenue from its income calculation. An independent valuation using the standard enterprise methodology applicable to a service and asset holding business in the Charlotte commercial real estate market placed the company's value at $4.1 million. The discrepancy between Robert's stated valuation and Howard Bell's independent valuation was $3.3 million. The second category Howard Bell identified concerned the retirement accounts. Robert Carter's financial disclosure had described the couple's retirement accounts as having substantially underperformed due to market conditions, and had presented their current value as significantly lower than their historical contribution level would suggest. Howard Bell examined the account statements for the preceding 5 years and identified a series of partial liquidations between 2020 and 2021, 11 withdrawals totaling $420,000, whose proceeds had been transferred to a brokerage account held in Robert Carter's individual name that had not been disclosed in his financial statement. The brokerage account was not, technically, visible in the household financial records Diane had access to. It was visible in the bank records Howard Bell obtained through the discovery subpoenas. The third and fourth categories, the LLC asset transfers and the 14 unaccounted-for cash withdrawals, he addressed last in the preliminary report, not because they were less significant, but because the business valuation discrepancy and the retirement account manipulation were sufficient, on their own, to fundamentally reframe the entire financial picture Robert Carter had presented in his divorce filing. What Howard Bell's preliminary report established was not merely that Robert had hidden some assets, it established that the financial disclosure he had submitted to the court was wrong in virtually every significant particular. Thomas Carter arrived at Patricia Okafor's offices on a Tuesday morning in September, accompanied by an attorney from Cabarrus County, whose primary practice was construction contract litigation, and who was, by his own admission during a pre-deposition phone call with Patricia's paralegal, less familiar with the specific complexities of family law asset tracing than the situation perhaps required. Thomas was 50 years old, a building contractor who had operated an honest business in Concord for 25 years, and he had the specific quality of a man who does things for his brother because his brother is more capable and it is easier to be useful than to explain that you do not fully understand what you are agreeing to. He answered the first portion of the deposition. Questions about his professional history, his financial background, and his investment experience, in the careful, minimal manner of someone who has been advised to say as little as possible. Patricia let him answer. She noted the answers. She moved methodically forward. Then she placed the LLC formation documents on the table in front of him and asked him to confirm his signature on the registered agent designation. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm the dates of incorporation. He confirmed them. She asked him what consideration he had provided in exchange for being designated the beneficial owner of assets valued at the time of transfer at approximately $2.3 million. He said he did not recall the specific arrangement. She placed Howard Bell's preliminary report on the table, specifically the pages tracing the capital transfers from Carter Development Group accounts to the LLC capitalization accounts, and asked him to read the highlighted section. He read it. She asked him whether he had any information that would contradict the analysis showing those funds originating from Carter Development Group accounts. He said he did not. She asked him one final question. Had Robert Carter, prior to the incorporation of the LLCs, discussed with him the purpose of having his name on the corporate documents? Thomas Carter looked at his attorney. His attorney said he could answer. Thomas Carter looked at the deposition table. He said he told me it was for tax planning purposes. Patricia Okafor wrote something on her notepad. She said thank you. She moved to the next question. The deposition transcript would be entered as Exhibit 14 in the subsequent hearing. It would not be contested by David Finch. Approximately 4 months into the discovery process, Marcus Carter attended a Sunday family dinner at his Uncle Thomas's house in Concord. He had been receiving, from his father, a version of the divorce proceedings that emphasized the unreasonableness of Diane's attorney and the manufactured nature of the legal conflict. Robert's version presented the discovery process as a fishing expedition organized by a vindictive law firm on behalf of a wife who was refusing to accept a fair and carefully considered settlement. Marcus was 22 years old and was, in the way of a young man who wants the world to be simpler than it is, substantially accepting this version. He was not comfortable with the acceptance. He had grown up watching his mother run a household with the quiet competence of someone who makes complicated things look simple, and the version his father was offering did not quite account for the person Marcus knew his mother to be. But he did not yet have a framework for the discomfort. He went to the dinner. At some point during the meal, Thomas Carter said something. Marcus has not disclosed publicly what it was. He has said it was not a confession. It was a comment, a reference to a timeline that did not align with the account Marcus had been given. A mention of a conversation between Thomas and Robert that placed the asset transfers earlier than Robert had described them. A detail that was small, but that Marcus recognized as the kind of detail that does not survive scrutiny once you apply it to the story around it. He drove back to Charlotte that evening without calling his father. He called Elena instead. He said he thought he had been given the wrong version of events. Elena said she knew. She said she had known for a long time. She said their mother was going to be okay. Marcus said he knew that now too. He had needed the dinner to understand it. Thomas Carter, sitting across a table in Concord under the weight of a subpoena and a deposition that had already taken place, had given him the clarification he needed without intending to give anyone anything at all. Robert Carter's deposition was scheduled for the following week. He arrived with David Finch at Patricia Okafor's offices in the composed manner of a man who had decided that the most effective posture at this stage was that of a person who had nothing to be concerned about and was prepared to demonstrate this through the quality of his composure. For the first 90 minutes, this was a credible performance. He had answers for the business valuation methodology questions, answers that were framed in terms of conservative assessment and the genuine uncertainty of the commercial real estate market in 2022. He had answers for the LLC formation, the same tax planning rationale Thomas had provided, stated with considerably more fluency. He had answers for the retirement account transfers, an investment strategy rationale that required Howard Bell's report to dismantle, rather than his own words. Patricia let him answer. She noted the answers. She moved methodically forward. Then she reached the section of the deposition that addressed the 14 cash withdrawals. She named each withdrawal individually, the date, the amount withdrawn, the account it came from. She asked Robert to identify the purpose of each one. He answered 11 of them with varying degrees of specificity. Household renovations, a cash payment to a contractor, a business entertainment expense, a personal loan to a friend that had been repaid. For 3 of them, spaced across the 18 months before the divorce filing, he said he did not recall the specific purpose. Patricia Okafor placed a single page on the table in front of him. It was a photographed page from Diane's composition notebook, one of the pages Diane had provided to Patricia 18 months prior, entered into the formal discovery file as Exhibit 7. The page showed 3 entries, each corresponding to one of the 3 withdrawal dates Robert had said he could not recall. Each entry was formatted identically: the date, the amount, the account, and a notation in Diane's handwriting that read, "No corresponding household expense identified." Patricia asked Robert whether, having reviewed this documentation, he could now identify the purpose of those 3 withdrawals. He said he could not. She said thank you. She moved to the next question. She did not return to those 3 withdrawals. She did not need to. The case came before Judge Sandra Whitmore of the Mecklenburg County District Court in November of 2022. Judge Whitmore had been on the family law bench for 11 years and had a professional reputation for reading financial situations with the same patience and precision that the situations required. David Finch entered 3 motions before proceedings began: a motion challenging Howard Bell's independent business valuation methodology, a motion challenging the admissibility of Diane's composition notebook as documentary evidence on the grounds that it was a personal diary rather than a business record, and a motion challenging the characterization of the LLC assets as marital property on the grounds that they were held by a legally separate entity. Patricia Okafor responded to each. Judge Whitmore denied all 3, ruling in sequence that the valuation methodology was sound, that the notebook's consistent dating, formatting, and factual character placed it within the category of contemporaneous records, admissible as evidence of the facts it documented, and that the transfer of marital funds to LLCs registered in a third party's name without the knowledge or consent of the other marital partner did not constitute a legitimate alienation of marital property under North Carolina's equitable distribution statute. The ruling on the LLC assets was the most consequential of the 3 denials. North Carolina's equitable distribution law requires that marital property acquired during the marriage using marital funds, be equitably distributed between spouses at the point of dissolution, regardless of whose name it is held in at the time of distribution. The question before Judge Whitmore was whether the LLCs registered to Thomas Carter represented legitimate third-party investment vehicles or a structured attempt to place marital property beyond the reach of the other spouse during divorce proceedings. Thomas Carter's deposition had established that he had provided no independent capital for the LLCs and had understood the arrangement to be a tax planning vehicle for his brother's business. Howard Bell's report had established that the capital funding the LLCs had originated exclusively from Carter Development Group accounts funded by the operations of a business that was itself a marital asset. Judge Whitmore found that the evidence, taken together, supported only one conclusion: the LLCs were marital assets held in a name designed to make them harder to find, and they would be treated as marital assets in the distribution order. Robert Carter's financial disclosure had presented a marital estate valued at approximately $1.4 million. Howard Bell's complete final report, incorporating the business revaluation, the retirement account transfers, and the LLC assets, placed the corrected marital estate at approximately $6.7 million. The difference between those two numbers, $5.3 million, represented the sum of Robert Carter's 2-year effort to exit a 22-year marriage with a financial advantage his wife could not identify, contest, or recover. In the end, he recovered none of the advantage. Judge Whitmore's equitable distribution order was detailed and specific. The family home, mortgage-free, 40% of Carter Development Group at the independently verified valuation of $4.1 million. 50% of the LLC assets, representing Diane's share of the marital funds used to capitalize them. The full value of the retirement account transfers that had been made without her knowledge or consent. And attorney's fees, the entirety of Diane's legal costs across the 7-month contested proceeding, on the grounds that Robert Carter's materially incomplete financial disclosure had unnecessarily extended and complicated the proceedings. David Finch requested a meeting with Robert Carter the day after Judge Whitmore's ruling was issued. He told his client, in the flat and careful language of a professional who has seen this outcome before and knows how to deliver it without editorializing, that the ruling was comprehensive, that the grounds for appeal were narrow given the evidentiary record, and that pursuing an appeal would extend the proceedings by an estimated 12 to 18 months while the underlying asset division order remained in effect. He told him that the composition notebook had been the document that defined the proceedings, that its consistent, contemporaneous documentation of financial irregularities, combined with Howard Bell's forensic accounting, had created an evidentiary foundation that was essentially unassailable. He told Robert that in 22 years of family law practice he had not encountered a pre-filing documentation file as thorough as the one Diane Carter had assembled. Robert sat across from his attorney in an office that he was paying for, with funds that were now considerably more constrained than they had been 12 months earlier. He did not file an appeal. He accepted the ruling. He signed the distribution documents 14 days after the order was issued. In the spring of the year following the divorce finalization, Diane Carter enrolled in a 6-month professional development program in interior design and space planning offered through a continuing education partnership with a Charlotte area university. She was 49 years old. She was the second oldest student in the cohort of 22. The oldest was a 54-year-old woman who was also returning to something she had set aside for a marriage. And they became friends in the way of people who find each other at a similar point, in a similar story, and recognize something in the other that does not need to be explained. The program covered the design principles Diane had always understood intuitively, and the business and technical aspects she had never been given the opportunity to formalize. Project management systems, sustainable material sourcing, commercial space planning regulations, construction phase coordination. She completed it in 5 months rather than 6 because she had been studying informally for 20 years, and the formal framework settled around existing knowledge rather than requiring her to build from nothing. She launched Carter Interiors in October of that year, from the home that was now entirely and unencumbered hers, operating from the office that had once held the locking drawer with the navy blue notebook in it. The locking drawer now held client files. She reached out to the referral network she had been building quietly for years, the friends and neighbors she had advised on their homes without payment, the professional contacts she had maintained through Robert's social world, while carefully positioning herself as a person with her own professional identity rather than merely a wife. And she converted the first referral to a paying client within 3 weeks of launching. The first project was a residential interior refresh for a family in South Charlotte. She delivered it in February. The client referred 3 additional contacts within the month. By the end of the first year, Carter Interiors had 7 active client files and a pipeline that had not required a single paid advertisement to build. The most important thing to understand about what happened to Robert Carter in the 3 years following the divorce is that none of it was the result of anything Diane Carter did. She did not pursue him. She did not contact his clients. She did not speak about him to their mutual social network in ways intended to damage his standing. She did not seek his failure. She had been in court to recover what was rightfully hers, and she had recovered it. and she was done with the project of Robert Carter in every sense except the administrative. What happened to him was the result of subtraction, the removal of things he had been relying on without recognizing he was relying on them. Melissa Wade left Carter Development Group in July of the year, the divorce finalized, giving the standard 90 days notice and citing professional differences. She took with her the management of two of the firm's largest commercial contracts she had brought into the firm through her own professional relationships and that the clients, given the choice, preferred to follow. Robert's business revenue dropped by 31% in the 12 months following Melissa's departure. He had moved into a penthouse apartment in an uptown Charlotte building in the months before the divorce filing, in the expectation that the settlement would proceed as he had structured it and leave him financially comfortable enough for this kind of lifestyle choice. The settlement had not proceeded as he had structured it. The penthouse was listed for sale 20 months after he moved in. Two of the investment properties that had remained in his name after the divorce distribution were sold in the second year to cover operating costs for the development firm, which was managing a reduced contract load without the senior business development associate who had been responsible for a significant share of its client relationships. By the end of year 3, Carter Development Group had 4 employees, down from 7 at the time of the divorce filing, and a portfolio that had been reduced from 12 investment properties to 6. The financial empire Robert Carter had spent 20 years building and 2 years restructuring to protect from his wife's claim had not been taken from him by the court ruling. It had been diminished by the removal of the things his wife had been contributing to it that he had never had the occasion to notice because she had never had the occasion to stop. In the spring of the 3rd year after the divorce, Carter Interiors was featured in a regional design and lifestyle publication, a 4-page profile of Diane Carter, and 3 of the residential projects she had completed in the preceding 18 months. The profile described her design sensibility as confident and livable, and described Carter Interiors as a firm that had grown through pure referral to 11 active client relationships in its 2nd year of operation. The photographs that accompanied the profile showed spaces that were, to anyone who had spent time in the rooms Diane had occupied across a 22-year marriage, the clearest possible expression of what she had always been capable of creating when she was the one making the decisions. The publication circulated in the professional and social communities that the Carters had moved in for 20 years. It was read by people who had attended their parties, who had accepted Robert's characterizations of who Diane was and what she was capable of, who had smiled at the word hobby the 2 times Robert had used it in their presence. Robert Carter attended a charity fundraiser in Charlotte in April of that year. The kind of event the Carters had attended together routinely for 2 decades. Black tie, a cause he had always supported. A room of people with whom he had maintained professional and social relationships across his career. He arrived, found his table, worked the cocktail hour with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this for 20 years. And then, at some point in the early part of the dinner hour, he became aware that Diane Carter was in the room. She was 2 tables from his. She had been introduced during the cocktail hour as a featured guest, a Charlotte designer whose recent regional profile had generated significant interest. She was in a conversation with 3 people, all of them engaged, all of them turned toward her in the specific posture of people who are interested in what the person they are listening to is saying. She was composed. She looked well. She was not looking in his direction. He did not go to her table during the cocktail hour. He did not send someone over. He ate his dinner and spoke to the people at his table about the things people speak about at tables at events like this one. And at some point in the latter part of the evening, he became aware that he and Diane Carter were briefly in each other's direct line of sight, a moment of mutual recognition across a crowded room at an event they were both attending for entirely different reasons and from entirely different positions. She did not change her expression. She held the eye contact for a moment of ordinary acknowledgement, the kind that 2 people who know each other well enough to recognize each other extend in a social setting, and then she returned to the conversation she had been having. He looked away. He finished his dinner. He said his goodbyes at the end of the evening, collected his coat, and walked to his car. There was nothing he could have said to her, in that room, on that evening, that would have changed a single thing about the story she was living. He had been wrong about which story he was in. She had known which story she was in since October of 2020, when she opened a navy blue notebook and wrote down the first date. Elena Carter had stood by her mother from the first week of the separation, without being asked, without explanation, and without the performance of loyalty that sometimes substitutes for it in family situations like this one. She came to dinner on Sundays. She helped Diane move furniture in the home office when Carter Interiors launched and the space needed to be reorganized for professional use. She referred her first client to her mother, a colleague from Atrium Health, who was renovating an apartment and needed help with the space planning. She did not speak about her father to Diane unless Diane asked directly, which was rarely. She maintained her own relationship with Robert on her own terms, which were quiet and bounded, and which neither of them discussed with Diane. Elena Carter had understood, by the time she was 19 years old, what kind of household she had grown up in, and she had made her decisions about what she believed and who she stood with a long time before the legal process made those decisions visible to anyone else. Marcus Carter called his mother on a Saturday evening in the second year after the divorce and asked if he could come for dinner. He came the following weekend, and they sat at the same kitchen table where Robert had laid out the settlement offer 3 years before, and Marcus said he was sorry it had taken him as long as it had to understand what had happened. Diane said she understood why it had taken the time it took, that the version of events Marcus had been given had been constructed carefully over years, and that the version she was living had only become fully visible to him once the legal process put it on record. She did not ask him to choose between his parents. She did not require him to condemn his father in order to be present with her. She required nothing from him except his presence, which he gave by showing up and sitting at the table and eating the dinner she had made. He came back the following Saturday. He has come back most Saturdays since. Marcus Carter brings the coffee. They talk for a long time at the table that is still the same table, in the house that is now entirely hers, in the kitchen that her mother would have recognized immediately as the kitchen of a woman who knows what she is doing. Carter Interiors is now in its 4th year of operation. It has 17 active client relationships. Diane Carter hired her first employee in the 3rd year, a junior designer named Angela, 24 years old and recently graduated from the same UNC interior design program Diane had left in 1996, and mentors her with the patient, specific attention of someone who understands what it means to be capable of something before the world has given you the space to demonstrate it. The home office that once held a locking drawer with a navy blue composition notebook in it now holds client files, material samples, project boards, and the organized warmth of a working professional space that Diane built from the same intelligence she was always bringing to every room she entered. The locking drawer still exists. The notebook is still in it. She has kept it, she has said, not because she expects to need it again, and not as a memorial to a period she would rather have behind her. She has kept it as a record of the day she decided to stop waiting for permission to understand the situation she was living in. A record of the first entry, the first date, the first line in a document that a man who thought he had planned everything had not thought to plan for. He thought leaving her with nothing was the end of the story. He was wrong about which story he was in. The story he had written for himself, the one where a careful man restructures a marriage's financial landscape over 2 careful years and exits with the better part of 20 years of shared wealth intact, required one thing to hold. It required Diane Carter to be the person he had decided she was. Dependent. Financially uninformed, unable to fight effectively even if she chose to. That was the version of his wife he had been building in his assessment for 22 years, constructed from the evidence available at the distance he had always maintained between her and the parts of their life he controlled. The assessment was wrong in every dimension. He had simply never known this because the person he was assessing had never had a reason to show him anything different. She showed him something different in a Mecklenburg County courtroom. She showed him something different in a Charlotte design publication 3 years later. She is showing him something different every day through a business she built from a locking drawer and a composition notebook and the specific understanding of a woman who grew up watching her mother keep ledgers and learned, before she had language for it, that money is information, and information is power, and power is what you build in the quiet while no one is watching. So here is the question I want to leave you with. Not a rhetorical one, a real one. If you had been sitting at that kitchen table on January 14th, and the folder had been placed in front of you, and the man across from you had said what Robert Carter said, "You can fight this, but it will cost you more than you will ever get," what would you have done? Would you have taken the offer? Would you have confronted him that night with everything you knew? Would you have called an attorney in the next county and opened a notebook 18 months ago and built the most comprehensive financial record anyone in that attorney's office had seen in 23 years? There is no wrong answer. There is only what you would have been capable of with what you had available to you in that specific room. But I will tell you what Diane Carter was capable of. She was capable of everything. He just never noticed. Leave your answer in the comments below. I rate every single one. We have just walked through one of the most methodical, patient, and ultimately complete reversals in a story that began with a man who believed he had thought of everything and ended with a woman who had thought of considerably more. And I want to hear what you took from it. Was it the notebook? The idea of starting 18 months early, before anyone knew what was coming? Was it Howard Bell finding $5.3 million in 11 days? Was it Thomas Carter in the deposition room saying he did not recall where $2.3 million had come from? Was it Diane at the charity event, 2 tables from the man who told her it would cost her more than she would ever get, returning to her conversation and letting him walk to his car? Leave the moment that hit you hardest in the comments. This channel runs on the conversations that happen down there, and I do not miss them. Before we go any further into this incredible story, do me a favor. If you love stories about justice, revenge, betrayal, and unexpected plot twists, hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, you do not want to miss what comes next on this channel. Drop a like on this video. It helps more than you think. And comment below where you are watching from, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Next week on Tales of Whisper, we are going to tell you about a woman who was told by 3 separate people, her sister, her accountant, and her first attorney, that what her husband had done was not technically illegal. She spent 14 months and a great deal of her own money finding out whether that was true. What she found at the end of those 14 months changed the professional opinion of at least 2 of the 3 people who told her to accept the situation. Subscribe to Tales of Whisper. New stories every single week. Stories about the people the room got wrong, about the documents nobody was supposed to find, about the notebooks nobody knew were being kept, and about what happens when the person who was counted out finally decides to be counted. We will see you next week.